Hey folks, welcome to another Passion for Sound audio review, and today we're taking a look at the Benchmark HPA4. I was lucky enough to pick one of these up secondhand recently. I believe there's a big price rise coming soon that's probably hit by the time this review comes out, but I was curious to see how it stacked up to some of my other flagship headphone amps that I've got here, and to see if I think it matches some of the hype that I've heard about this unit. At the time of this recording, the price listed on the Benchmark website is $3,299 with an extra $100 if you want the remote control. And then there's also an extra price if you want this in a rack mount system, which you can do as well. And that makes it quite similarly priced to the Sparkos Labs Aries and also the Burson Soloist GT, two other amps that I love, that I've used, and I've owned. And so that for me was the comparison with the HPA4. And I wanted to see, could it knock off the Soloist GT and or the Sparkos Labs Aries as two of the very best headphone amps I've ever heard. The calling card or the claim to fame of the HPA4 here is that it uses the THX 888 AAA technology. That's a feed-forward distortion management system that's meant to provide an incredibly transparent and incredibly clean sound. More basic versions of this have been used in amps like the Drop THX 789, some of the FIO products use THX as well, but this, as I understand it, is the first amp and maybe the only headphone amp to use the 888 level, which as I understand it is the most advanced version of the THX process. In addition to the THX technology, there's also some other really cool things going on in the HPA4, such as a stepped and fully balanced relay gain control. So what that means is that when you turn this dial here, it's actually using a ladder of resistors to adjust the volume control, as I understand it. But the key point being that it's absolutely level matched with very precise steps across 256 levels of volume. And so that means that you can get absolute precise control for IEMs at the very lowest volume levels, all the way through to your more difficult to drive planar magnetic or high impedance dynamics. When we're speaking about difficult to drive headphones, the HPA4 is rated to output 3 watts into 32 ohms, which is not crazy powerful, but it's plenty powerful enough to drive most headphones effectively. Having said that though, I was finding that I was getting towards the upper limits of it with things like the DCA Expanse and also the RAL CA1A. And if you want to see a review on the RAL CA1A, make sure you hit the subscribe button. While we're talking about features and functions and specs, it's also worth mentioning there's all sorts of protective circuits in here. I'm not going to list them all here, but basically this thing is intelligent enough to catch and prevent any kind of overload, whether it's coming from the input, the output, whatever might be going wrong. This is going to catch it and stop it before it can do any damage. And then the final feature to talk about, and it's really probably what gives you access to a lot of the features I've been talking about so far, is the display screen here. So there's this nice color display screen here that gives you access to volume control with independent control or combined control for the line outs and the headphone outs. At a press of a button, you can do things like pull back 20 dB, which is really handy if you just need to really quickly cut the sound and then go back to the volume that you were working at. You can name the input so it's easy to know which amp you're using on which input. There's lots of different functionality all through this touchscreen, and it's a really lovely interface. And so from a specifications, design, physical build quality point of view, the HPA4 is stunning. It's smaller than I expected it to be, and I mean that in a good way. It's a really compact unit for the amount of power, both in terms of the power to drive headphones, but also the power in terms of the features and the functions. It's an incredible device, both in terms of size and even what you're getting for the cost. Now, of course, some of that's going to come down to how it sounds, and we will get there soon. But before we do, let me give you a quick tour of the device. We've mostly covered the front panel, but there's a couple more things there, and then we have to look at the back as well. Taking a quick look at the front, we've got under the screen that I've already mentioned, we've got a power on-off button. We've then got further along a 6.3mm headphone out and a 4-pin XLR balanced headphone out, and then the volume control that I mentioned before. So the front panel's pretty simple. There's lots of options available through the touchscreen that I've already mentioned. But let's now take a look at the back to really understand the versatility of the HPA4 here. When you look at the back panel here, the biggest thing that's going to stand out probably is just how many inputs and outputs we've got. We've got 2 pairs of XLR inputs, 2 pairs of RCA outputs, so a total of 4 different outputs for different sources. And then on top of that, you've got a pair of RCA lineouts and a pair of XLR lineouts. And those, of course, are volume controlled. This is a fully functional preamp as well. But then if we keep on looking, there's also a couple more things as well. You've got some 12-volt trigger outputs here. That's going to allow you to switch on other devices with the signal coming from the HPA4. And then below the 12-volt outputs, there's also another single 3-pin XLR. And that's for what's called a summed mono output. So the idea of this is it's going to take the balanced signal and sum it down to a single mono signal. And as I understand it, that's something that's often used in a studio environment. It's probably not something many consumers are going to use. But it goes to show the very kind of studio professional orientation of a device like the HPA4, which is not to say you shouldn't use it for home use, but it's also very much suited for use in studios, hence both the summed mono output and also the ability to get it as a rack mount if you want it. And so design, features, function, form factor, build quality, everything so far is nothing short of top notch. It's a really, really impressive device. And so the question now comes, how does it sound? And I'm going to sum this up really fast by saying it just sounds exceptional. It's an incredibly revealing and detailed amp that gives you all sorts of insight into the music. But rather than try and talk about it in isolation and try to explain why it's so exceptional, I think the best thing I can do is actually put it into context by putting it up next to things like the Soloist GT and the Sparkos Labs Aries. Trying to work out what gear you should buy next? Have a look at the Passion for Sound Recommends link down in the description below. Clicking on the link will take you through to my Patreon page and specifically a post where you can click on the Airtable image to go through to my recommended products database. Once you're in the database, you can use the filter button up the top to choose which sorts of product types you want to have a look at, maybe headphones, maybe DACs, maybe amps. Choose the one or ones that you want to see from this list, and then you can also sort the list by price if you want to, or other features as well. You'll then see a consolidated list just of the product types you want to have a look at, including things like what the retail price was when I last checked. You've got links to my reviews of each product, and then also links to where you can go and buy them. Feel free to play around with the filters and sorting options as much as you like to find the gear you're looking for, and I hope that this database points you in just the right direction for you. So happy hunting, happy listening, and now let's get back to the review. And I'm going to start things off by putting the HPA4 up against my all-time favourite so far, which is the Burson Soloist 3X GT. And for this test, one of the tracks I used was Funky Stuff by the Seatbelts. This is from the Cowboy Bebop soundtrack. And for this testing, I was using the Meza Elites, and I was driving the HPA4 from the TT2 as a DAC. Starting off with the HPA4, the first things that stood out was how strong the imaging is. This amp is so precise and so clean that you just hear everything in the soundstage exactly where it's meant to be. Something I did notice was that the staging was very left-right, but as it turns out, that's actually in the recording, so it's not a knock against the HPA4, it's just delivering exactly what's in the recording, which is a very left-right spread of certain sounds. Having said that though, one area where I do find the HPA4 doesn't always stack up against things like the Aries and the GT is that the soundstage is a relatively flat soundstage. It's not dead flat, it doesn't feel compressed or wall of soundish, but it is quite a left-right sense of sound rather than having a bit more sense of depth like, say, the Aries does. I think the Soloist GT is also stronger in that area, so that is one area that the HPA4 falls just a little bit flat for me, but I know that's not a big deal for some people. As I continue to listen to Funky Stuff through the HPA4, what I noticed was that the sound is just incredibly clean and crisp and textured, but not harsh, not sterile, it's just excellent quality sound. The bass in this track has a good sense of punch and control from the HPA4. And when we're talking about the bass, the other thing that I noticed was that you can really hear the clarity of the bass strings being plucked. So you're getting the bass notes, but you're also getting all that texture and detail around the plucking of the strings too. And so at this point, the HPA4 to me was sounding like an insanely good amplifier at any price really. But that was without context as yet, so I flipped over to the Soloist GT to see how it compared against the HPA4. And what I heard was the bass guitar that I mentioned before was just a little bit fuller from the GT. We're talking about 0.5%, maybe 1%, but it just had a tiny bit more body to it. As I've already mentioned, this track is quite a left-right spread in terms of how it's recorded, and the Soloist GT once again sounded very left-right because of that recording. Having said that, as I listened on, I do feel like the Soloist GT was giving me just a little bit more depth in the soundstage. When I listened to tracks that had things that were placed, say, behind a singer, off to the side, I got a better sense of the kind of physical layout of the stage from the Soloist GT, a bit more so than I did from the HPA4. Having said that, it wasn't a huge jump. It was a small incremental step, and so I think both amps have their strengths and weaknesses. Another strength of the GT that I found was that the music comes from it in a more fluid way. With the HPA4, I didn't ever feel like I was quite as relaxed with the music as I am with the GT. The HPA4 does come across sounding a bit more clinical. I don't want to say artificial because it doesn't sound artificial, but there's something not as natural and easy to listen to about the sound. At about the 45-second mark in this track, being funky stuff from Cowboy Bebop, at about the 45-second mark, there's a slap bass line. And the slap bass from the HPA4, when compared to the GT, comes across sounding just a little bit kind of clinical. The GT gives it a bit more fullness and body, and it just flows more easily from that amp. And so that's where I do find the split between the two. The HPA4 is incredibly insightful, but also slightly clinical at the same time, whereas the GT is a bit more organic, a bit smoother, a bit more mellow, but with no lack of clarity or attack or detail or punch. In fact, it's got a bit more punch than the HPA4. One final point of difference worth mentioning is that I also feel like the HPA4 defines the image just a little tiny bit more tightly than the Soloist GT does. And that can be for better or worse. It's one of those things where by defining everything more tightly, it also separates things a bit more and therefore isn't always quite as kind of coherent sounding. It's not incoherent. I don't want it to sound like I'm suggesting that it's overly separating the sounds. But for me, as I said before, with the Soloist GT, everything could kind of just wash over me as the music and I could take it all in. With the HPA4, it's separating everything to the point where it's a whole lot of pieces put together rather than one kind of coherent set of music. And that sounds like a knock against the HPA4. I don't intend it to be. Indeed, for a studio type, production type situation, the HPA4 would probably be the much better choice than the GT. But for musical enjoyment, I did find myself preferring the GT by just a couple of percent. While we're talking about those couple of percent differences, one final thing that I did put in my notes was that I feel like the HPA4 is just losing a little bit of the harmonic richness and naturalness of the music. And I don't know if that's because of the THX technology and the way the feedback circuits work, but for me, there's a certain naturalness and an ease and a harmonic richness to the Soloist GT that I just lack a bit from the HPA4. The HPA4 is technically incredible, but it's not as musically engaging as the Soloist GT, and I don't feel like the Soloist GT is worse in any way technically. They're just different presentations. This one focuses you on the technicalities, but I think the technicalities are all still there from the GT. It's just more enjoyable at the same time. And so having done all my listening between the GT and the HPA4, it was now time to put the HPA4 up against the Sparkos Labs Aries. The Aries is a slightly more kind of rich, organic sounding amp. It's not warm or overly smooth, but it's got a slightly more kind of musical character than something like the Soloist GT does. And so I already knew a little bit about where this was going, but I was curious to see what other trade-offs, what other pros or cons there might be when comparing the HPA4 to the Sparkos Labs Aries. One of the tracks I used for this comparison was Kyoto by Phoebe Bridgers. And as you'd expect, the HPA4 started off sounding clean and crisp and very insightful again. Going over to the Sparkos Labs Aries, and I immediately heard a bit more fullness and smoothness in the sound. And it wasn't that it was losing detail to get that, it was just being delivered with kind of a layer of creaminess, if you like. Jumping back and forth between the two, what it means is that the HPA4 will deliver a bit more air, a bit more breath and texture in vocals, whereas the Sparkos Labs Aries doesn't kind of promote or enhance those things. And on the other hand, what the Aries gives is a bit more sense of weight in the mid-range. So the vocal quality from the Aries is to me at times more enjoyable than the HPA4, but it comes at the cost of some of that insight that you get. Once again, the HPA4 separates things more than the Aries does, and that can be for better or worse. One of the things I love about the Aries is how kind of coherent and together and effortless it is. Whereas with the HPA4, as I've already talked about with the GT comparison, it can get just a little bit too clinical sometimes. It can have me focusing on the individual parts of the music rather than the whole musical picture. What I was finding at this point though was that the track Kyoto wasn't giving me a great deal of understanding of the differences between the Aries and the HPA4, and so I turned to one of my test tracks that I use. This is a track that I've shared in my curated playlists that the patrons get access to, and it's called Greek Song by Rufus Wainwright. Going across to that track, and what you hear in terms of the nuances of textures and the micro details from the HPA4 is nothing short of amazing. That's where this amp to me can be absolutely incredible, is that it just gives you so much texture and detail that you've probably never heard before. In the opening of Greek Song, there's some sort of percussion. I'm not entirely sure what they're using, but there's a bit of a sort of a rattling sound that's created each time they hit or shake whatever this percussion device is. And from the HPA4, those little tiny details in the shakes are really evident. What I found when I went to the Aries was they became less clear and less evident. Having heard that now from the HPA4, I was interested to quickly jump back to the Soloist GT and see what that was doing with the same details. And it was interesting to hear that the Soloist GT delivered that same detail just like the HPA4, but it emphasized it less. So it was still there if I wanted to hear it, but it was kind of more mixed into the music in a way that I find more enjoyable and natural, but the HPA4 is still incredibly good. One other reason I went to Greek Song for this test was that there is, I think it's called an erhu or an erhu. It's a Chinese single-stringed instrument. It's played about a third of the way through Greek Song in the background. And I know this particular instrument should be placed kind of just slightly back in the soundstage and off to the right slightly from memory. And what I found was that from something like the Soloist or the Aries, the erhu was a bit back in the soundstage. But when I had the HPA4 playing, it was brought more forward. And so that's what I was saying before, where the HPA4 does flatten the soundstage a little bit. It's not dead flat, it's not bad in any way, but it doesn't have quite the same sense of depth that something like the Soloist GT or the Aries can deliver. And I'm going to assume that's down to the circuitry that's being used, whether it's that it's using chip-based op-amps or the THX technology, I don't know, but it doesn't give you quite the same sense of soundstage depth and layering that either of these other two do. And so it really comes down to what you're looking for. I wouldn't sit here for a second and say that any one of these three is the perfect amp. They've all got pros and cons. I think the Sparkos Labs Aries can be the most enjoyable from a pure music enjoyment point of view. It's got the most natural and organic and kind of fluid sound to it, but it's also not the most revealing of these. So if you do value lots of detail and clarity, then the Aries might not be the choice. And that's where the HPA4 is absolutely insane. As I said before, the levels of detail and nuance and sort of micro detail resolution that you're getting from the HPA4, I've not heard anywhere else before. It's a very clinical and technical amplifier, but not in a way that makes it soulless. It doesn't have quite the same sense of enjoyment factor as I would say the Soloist GT and the Aries do in terms of that kind of rhythm and drive from bass, that harmonic richness of the sound, but it's still a very enjoyable amp that's also incredibly technical. And then finally, we've got the Soloist GT, which for me is kind of the perfect balance. It goes toe-to-toe with the HPA4 on technicalities, but is also incredibly enjoyable like the Sparkos Labs Aries. And so what we've got here are three fantastic amplifiers, all three excellent choices. And so hopefully I've been able to give you some clarity as to which one might be the right one for you. As always, if you have found this video useful and helpful, I'd love it if you hit the like button, consider subscribing, and ring the notification bell if you haven't already. But for now, let me leave it to the music, so happy listening, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.